Thank you very much, Chris, for that a very kind introduction. And many thanks to all of you for tuning in and joining this event. It's now 4 p.m. here in Lund, a little quaint town in southern Sweden where the university is. And I hope you can see the nice old cathedral right behind my window and so on. And I'm at my office, so at the university, and that's allowed in Sweden right now. We have a little bit of different recommendations and so on in various countries, but it's not as laissez-faire as the international media says about Sweden. It's pretty strict here as well, just as in the UK and elsewhere. But in this event, I'm going to give you a few snapshots from the book, and I hope I won't give away too much since there is so much more in the book than I have time to present, obviously, not least intriguing ideas and experiences shared by a number of people I've interviewed in Oxford and the London region about knowledge resistance. And I wrote this book mainly in 2018 when my family and I had spent 2 years in Oxford and in London. And naturally, the book is very influenced by the turbulent times of the following the Brexit referendum and Trump's election and so on. But still, I've been working really hard when I wrote this book to avoid being caught up in the main issue of the specific time period in which the book was written. I finished it in mid 2019. Therefore, I've tried to make sure that the findings of the book are applicable to the events century ago, but also in the years to come after the book was finalized some months ago. So this means also, I would dare say, that the book is relevant it can help us make some sense of the corona pandemic as well, even though it's not, it hadn't broken out when the book was finalized, because the book investigates how and why leaders ignore health authorities in some cases, how and why certain groups of the public mistrusts health authorities and the health sciences, and instead develop their own group-based informal belief systems and norms, and also what we could do about it. So the cases directly and explicitly covered in the book, they include climate change, vaccination, mainly measles vaccination, artificial intelligence, the origins of the human species, evolution, nature nurture, child rearing in various culture. What's the best way to, or healthiest way to raise our kids? Gender roles, genetically modified organisms, religion, and more. So you hear that's a wide range of topics where I still try to make certain general comments and give ideas for how the knowledge resistance works in these cases and how it could be overcome when it's problematic. So and in the book I'm using a few different sources. I've already mentioned the interviews. I conducted a large number of interviews with social, economic, and evolutionary scientists in Oxford and various universities in London. And I've also analyzed the media coverage in the cases that I've mentioned. And then, of course, I've done extensive literature analysis of the social, economic, and evolutionary sciences in how people and organizations relate to knowledge claims, and sometimes resist them and sometimes absorb them uncritically and so on. And finally, I couldn't help by bringing in my own anecdotal examples from when that was ages ago, when I was 17 and I spent a year in a high school in the US and stayed with a Christian, evangelical, charismatic family. Yeah, the family was charismatic in several ways, but the church was of that evangelical kind, and I come as the stereotype about Swedes, I guess, is from a secular social liberal home and so on, and the cultural clashes and how we viewed various parts of reality are brought into the analysis. So now I'm gonna just mention the book's main proposition, and let's see. It is that when truth-seeking and social cohesion, when they are in conflict, we should be expected most of the time, and most of us, and in most situations, to prioritize the latter, to prioritize keeping our social groups intact and not deviate too much from the social norms in the groups where we find ourselves. And why is that then? Well, my argument is that in order to understand how we humans relate to knowledge and what knowledge means to us, we need to go back all the way till when we were hunter-gatherers, and that's quite often done. You know, think about the savannah and so on. But I think it's really apt to do that here, because you can see that in 99.7% of our times as human beings on Earth, I mean, as a species, we have lived as hunter-gatherers. So all of us are adapted genetically to, in a way that is somehow functional to life in as hunter-gatherers. And if you go back to those times, and there are still a few cultures or societies that base their lives on hunting and gathering, those among the earliest humans who were never prepared to adopt to the beliefs of their community and never agreed with the others about, you know, what God is, or who the gods are that are important, and what risks are the most urgent ones, and so on. Those individuals who never agreed with the others, they ran the risk of being distrusted and by extension excluded from the group. And being excluded, social exclusion, we know that's a huge problem today with loneliness and so on. All the health problems and well-being that is reduced when people are socially excluded or what do you call it? Live in loneliness without having the choice. And it's dangerous today, but social exclusion in among hunters and gatherers meant an enormous increased risk of facing an unnatural death caused by other groups with no one to help us. So these humans had far lower chances of surviving, reproducing, and becoming the ancestors of us today. So we are the descendants to the worrying kind, so to speak, or to those who think, okay, let's join the belief systems of the group so that I can be accepted there. And concretely, how does that relate to climate change and these various topics that I'm bringing up in the book? Well, you can see in studies that climate deniers, if we use that crude terms, it's unfair partly because there are many nuances, but let's do that here still. So climate deniers who score the highest in their group of climate deniers who score the highest on scientific literacy tests in their group, they are more confident than the average climate denier that climate change isn't happening. So they are more extreme in their climate denial if they know a lot of real, mainstream science than those who don't know as much. And on the other hand, those who are, we call them the climate concerned, those who are worried about and think this is a real problem, the climate concerns those among that group who score the highest on the same tests of scientific literacy. They're more confident than the average climate concerned that climate change is actually happening. So how could you explain that? My explanation is that both these highly scientifically literate groups, among deniers and among concerned, they use their skills or scientific knowledge to strengthen their position in their own community. So they prioritize the social cohesion and their position in their separate groups. And that raises their status in their own communities. Instead of, as intuition, as I had thought before I learned this, that those literate, those who knew a lot of science from the two groups would move close to each other in their beliefs. It's actually the opposite, and that's a strong sign of that. It's a social motivation that rules here for both groups, actually. Yes, and you can also see it in the sciences and in universities, that people in compartmentalized disciplines often don't recognize how much insights from the neighboring disciplines, rival disciplines, they are missing. And there is even a proud ignorance that I could see in my interviews when people from one discipline said, "Oh, I would never waste my time looking at the similar problem as I do, but from the angle of the other discipline, because my perspective is simply better, and it would be a waste of time," and so on. So my claim here is that knowledge resistance is everywhere, but not all the time. And this goes against the public debate that followed from Brexit and Trump and all of this, where there is a simplistic view that knowledge resistance is something that other groups are involved with, often the religious right or those with little education and so on, whereas whoever we are of course enlightened and rational in our views. But still, all of us select the knowledge we accept and not, and we do it partly for social reasons. So I'm going to give you 2-3 of the several themes and actually rationales behind knowledge resistance. I've tried to understand this phenomenon, not just to say, "Oh, isn't it awful how knowledge resistant people are?" So I want to understand why and really get into the, what do you call it, the shoes of various groups, from left to right, from religious to atheists and so on. And that's what I try to do in this book. First, it's kind of cliche to criticize Trump these days. Everyone does that, but I couldn't help, because it was such a nice graph that illustrates what I would claim is an example of knowledge resistance in how Trump related to the coronavirus in the US in February, for instance. You can see here, I hope you can follow me, where these are Trump's quotes. Somewhere in January, he learned, of course, that the virus was in China and that was problematic. And the health experts and health agencies and so on in the US informed Trump that, well, this is going to come to the US, and this is we really need to prepare this. But partly due to what's the theme in this theme here, partly due to Trump's concern about societal consequences, economic consequences, and his political consequences for him and his group and so on, he actually resisted the advice from the experts during a large part of February. So it's going to be fine. And then he said in late February, we're going very substantially down, not up, in the risk in the US. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear. And this is their new hoax. He started to talk about a hoax from those who said that it's going to be worse in the US. We need to prepare thoroughly. And all the way up to in March, before March 19, I've always known this is a real, this is a pandemic, and it's a huge deal. So, and then just a couple of days ago, a journalist asked Trump, so Mr. President, what did you do to prepare for the corona problem in the US in February? And his response was, "Oh, you are disgraceful," was his response. So it's kind of, but again, it's an almost over obvious example here, and again in the book I try to go beyond this, pointing at knowledge resistance among certain groups and not of others. You can see, for instance, in when I bring that up in the book, when I'm a sociologist in the US, they had an opinion poll all over the US where they asked about men's statistically greater violence, propensity towards violent aggression, statistically at least, than women. The question was, does that have anything to do with genetics or biology? Of course, in combination with the cultural and norms and so, but does it have anything to do with genetics or biology? I think 70% said no to that, which is clearly fascinating, given that the same pattern can be found all over history and in all cultures. Men have been more violently aggressive than women. But interestingly, they moved from the quantitative studies of the polls and asked people more in depth. And then the sociologist said that, well, if we include biology and genetics in the explanatory picture of men's violence, it is as if there were nothing that could be done to prevent male violence. We somehow legitimize male violence, or make it natural, or make it say that we can't do anything about it, which is not at all what it means if we include biology and genetics. It means taking in account a more complex picture of nature always being intertwined with nurture. So and that can be quite counterproductive to, close our eyes to certain important scientific findings out of fear about the societal consequences, which might not even arise. So that was one theme, and that's about fear of what will happen in society if everyone recognizes a certain knowledge claim as being true. I call that the chapter, by the way. I was quite proud over that name of the chapter. What if the Earth is round? Concerns about societal consequences. Yeah. I had a happy moment there when I wrote that little line. So, and theme number 2, it's about how issues are framed. That often turns out to influence our inclination to believe or resist it. As humans, we can never understand the world or any problem actually without framing it, narrowing it down, defining what is the problem, and what angles do we perceive the problem from, and so on. And that also means that how problems are framed influences our brains, so that they can really have an impact on whether we believe, we fear a certain part of reality, or whether we how we deal with the problem in question. And here, one example here is this with vaccination of measles, where they extremely few, if any, I would say no good studies have been done showing that measles vaccine causes autism among children. Still, there's many large groups who still believe this. And one reason for this, when I interviewed George Gaskell with the E there, when I interviewed him, he's a risk perception scholar, fantastic scientist. He mentioned this, that you could change the frame, because shots, I mean, measles vaccine is, there is a frame around that, an image that we all can relate to. And many people perceive vaccination as a shot containing an enemy substance that you give into an innocent, healthy baby. That's very counterintuitive to do that, right? With an enemy substance. And shot, you hear, of course, it's like a pistol shot or something, an enemy, so to speak. Instead, you could reframe the issue into a substance strengthening our body's intelligence service, helping us identify an enemy, hindering the enemy having an impact. So, and that has actually been done with certain groups of those who are very skeptical towards vaccination, and that has helped change their views a little bit of it. You can see it now with the coronavirus, and previously with SARS, that they in Canada managed to, I don't know if it's good or bad, but in Canada, a main framing among many people were that to infect someone elderly or someone with reduced immune defense with SARS was is equal to manslaughter. Actually, that was the framing. So that there was considered an extremely serious crime, whereas in other cultures, perhaps partly Sweden, it's you know, we as humans often have see a huge difference between actively slaughtering someone and passively contaminating someone that we didn't want to contaminate with something. It just happened. And even if we weren't cautious at all, or even if we were irresponsible, it's not like manslaughter. That's usually the view. But in Canada, they managed to frame it in that more serious way. And the same thing is, some say that climate change. How come that people on the religious right are often more don't believe in climate change as much as people to the left? And some, and I among them, say that climate change has so far largely been framed as a leftist, in a leftist liberal way, the way leftists and liberals see climate change as a threat to world solidarity. And we need to, out of solidarity with the entire globe, we need to reduce our climate CO2 footprints and so on. But that's a very narrow, that's one way of seeing climate change. You can also see it in a more conservative way, that we need to reduce the risk of climate change so that the individual can preserve his or her freedom to live her life. No one should reduce my freedom because they don't care about the climate. You could talk about the sanctity of nature, the authority of your country to prevent climate change, and also sense of community and so on. And you have several environmental projects, for instance, Don't Mess with Texas, where they have used these more conservative framings in order to have people reduce their pollution a lot, and that has been really successful there. So that was framing. And thirdly, the third theme, final theme I will bring up here, ties to this that I mentioned earlier, the counterintuitive nature of some topics. For instance, it takes very little, a few very bad scientific studies can still get a huge resonance around the globe if they say that measles vaccine may cause autism, for instance. And it doesn't matter if there are 1,000 times more and better studies pointing to the reverse. There will still be it will have tough competition between the various two stances, and that's partly also because of the counterintuitive nature of giving little children a shot. It's so against what our emotions and so on, even though we know intellectually, many of us, that it's good. And the same is true with other issues. To the left here, we have a group of Asian people, because the most primitive human intuition with and this has to do with corona, when faced with a threat, for instance corona, is to quickly identify a group of enemies, the others, who you believe causes the threat, and these others should ideally be of a different ethnicity or race than your own. And that's what happened in London and many other areas where Asians, just a few days after I started to talk about corona, were attacked, even though they were not even from China. They might have been from other countries, and let alone from Wuhan. They were still being attacked. And that's kind of a very human, intuitive way of being a knowledge resistance to the more sound, wider picture of where that all Asians or all people of the same ethnicity are not the same. And obviously, if you lived in, if you haven't been in China for decades, this is does not come from you, and so on. But the reverse you can see in China, where conspiracy theories are really spread about corona being caused by US biowarfare, which they have at least asked many people in China, and they still think that that's a true possibility. I'm not sure, but I've heard interviews where I said, yeah, might be the case. But the interesting thing is how easy it is to believe in such conspiracy theories, because it relates to the others and blaming another group. So you can see it on both sides. And secondly, just briefly about the climate change here. This is also, some also say that that's counterintuitive, because we have a, what do you call it, object bias as humans. It's much easier for us to see processes as if they were static objects, or products or objects and so on. So for instance, climate, we intuitively we see the climate as stable, whereas that is changing, but it's hard for us to grasp. We understand that weather is changing, but and when the weather is changing and it's a bit cold couple of years, we might emotionally think that this is okay, so climate change is probably not happening, and so on. And the same is true with just you see in all mythologies about the human origin, it's often that men and women were created as finished products, so to speak. And we often think about ourselves and others as personalities, stable persons, even though we know that both our views and values and cells in our bodies are actually processes. So that's part of the counterintuitive thing. So, and one way to deal with this, what do you do with these counterintuitive cases? Well, I'm expanding on that a lot in the book, but let me just say that it has to do with creating better stories about scientific phenomena, but turning them more into stories that defy stereotypes when it comes to this left picture, but also stories that follow the narrative mode rather than the systemic mode. So the narrative mode has a person with motives and a conclusion. And you can see, for instance, in evolutionary science, that even scientists themselves, if you hear them discuss in their meetings, they talk about natural selections experiments to find solutions to problems. Natural selection is, everyone knows, if you believe in natural selection, most according to theory, that's random and it's impersonal and has no goal at all. So, but still, in order to grasp the ideas, even the evolutionary sciences need to personalize what natural selection is in order to make it understandable to themselves. So, and the same we need to do when we explain to ourselves and to others about climate change and vaccination and what have you, and Corona not least. So, and finally, I'm gonna. I know Chris was curious and asked me a question earlier, but isn't it sometimes good to resist knowledge, in fact? And of course it is. We couldn't survive if we just try to know everything or believe everything or so on. We must sort between knowledge claims and facts, and we have certain ways of doing it. But there are certain issues in society where it's actually good with ignorance. To the left, we have an audition for a symphony orchestra. This may sound very niche, like a small thing, but it has to do with all job applications or exams or so on, where it used to be the case that the one auditioning was just playing and the board or whatever was listening and judging, and it was almost only men who got the positions in symphony orchestra because they were simply better, was the conclusion among people, even if they found themselves open-minded and so on. But then someone said, no, but it could be some gender issue here. So let's put a screen. You see the screen to the left here. And they put screens in several orchestras in auditions. And they tried that, but it was a few women, but still the vast majority were men. So then some said, okay, so men are better musicians. They thought that until someone, a smart person, said, wait a minute. Those who are auditioning, they should take off their shoes. The others asked, why take off their shoes? Well, women and men walk very differently, and they have different shapes of the shoes, high heels and so on. So, and they tried that. And when those auditioning did that, the percentage of men and women are much more equal. It could be even more women in symphony orchestras than men, at least around half, I believe. So that was because implicitly or unconsciously, perhaps if we get Freudian or something, the sound of the shoes made people believe that the persons played nicer. So, and the same ignorance is often. People ask for ignorance. It's a little bit like people ask for silence. Where can I find a place that is silent in this noisy world? People ask for some ignorance when it comes to their future risks of diseases or things like that. Now, when big data are collecting more about us than we might want to know at all. So that's a discussion that is really increasing. So these are a few examples of the what's in the book, and I hope that has given you a flavor of it and that you like to read it as well if you haven't already. So now I'm looking forward to a few questions here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mikael. I thought it was a very interesting talk, and I'm just going to throw it out there. If anyone does have any questions, please do type away. I've got a few of my own, which I'm going to ask Mikael, but we can get round to your questions as soon as possible. We do have a policy in the armchair events. We don't call out the person who's raised the question's name, so they can keep their anonymity if that's how they want to be. So my first question really is, obviously in this age of sort of disinformation and information overload, has our relationship to ignorance and knowledge resistance changed over the years? And maybe just talk about the history of knowledge resistance. Yeah,
so knowledge resistance has always existed, and we have a preparedness, most of us, to resist some knowledge, especially if it comes from another group, and if it really challenges the power relation in our own group and so on. And I think most of us can identify with or recognize this in our own lives and so on. But still, lately, or more lately, politicians have very actively tried to polarize the public in several countries, so that even knowledge claims or scientific facts, if we put it simply, have become political. So when I grew up in the 70s, you often heard in bourgeoisie circles that, oh, if you're with a broad range of people, you should not bring up your political values or sex or religious values either, because that will be uneasy. Now that has been broadened among some discussion into, oh, you shouldn't discuss climate change because whether that exists or not, or you shouldn't discuss genetically modified food, whether they are safe or unsafe, or vaccination. And these are actually more knowledge-based issues. It's not just values, it's more knowledge. So that has probably changed. But we should also, when we hear people in groups that say things, make knowledge claims that sound outrageous today, we should also recognize that many knowledge claims are actually loyalty claims. A loyalty claim is something you say just to show that I belong to my group. When I wrote this book, I got tons of emails from flat earthers, for instance. And some had very sophisticated arguments. I couldn't follow them. Others had more simple ones. But you should know that we should all recognize that believing something entirely different, the group that does that really strengthens their social bonds. So the more different from mainstream your group's belief is, the more you strengthen your group. And you can find that a lot today. But in the Corona case, you can see that in a way, we make all our assumptions and complain about other groups' conclusions or theories about the coronavirus, but ultimately nature will show us who was right and who was not, and what was the best way to address these uncertainties. So that's something I don't know where I was going with that, but still. Go ahead with more.
Okay, I've got a question here. So is there evidence that knowledge resistance is different in different political regimes? So totalitarian, say, versus democratic, for instance?
Yeah, there is. There are signs that it's more. You're more inclined to resist knowledge if you have a huge pressure from the regime, and that's a way, kind of your social motivation. If we talked with social cohesion, that's more important than truth. Imagine if you, by opposing a knowledge claim by a totalitarian regime, run the risk of losing your job, or your kids run the risk of losing their position in school or whatever. Of course, you will be more careful with and it's better to stick to what the group says. And there are, per definition, certain types of groups. If you're a very sect-like religious group, then it's far more strict, and if you don't stick to the belief of the group, you are out or so. But ideally in scientific groups, it's ideally built into the system to be critical there. I should also say, as a Swede, we often have this consensus tradition, which many of us are very proud of. Oh, we talk and we think the same and so on and make decision quite smoothly. But that's also risky. If it's too consensual, then it takes very little in order for an individual to look different or feel that he or she is deviating and is frowned upon, because we should believe more or less the same. And there, when I've lived in the US, I've seen that's more refreshing, that you can actually say the more outrageous things there, and it becomes an interesting discussion, but it's not as shocking as in Sweden. So, yeah.
Okay, so next one. So you indicated that social cohesion will be prioritized over truth-seeking, but the recent trend in business and government for cognitive diversity suggests that the alternative can sometimes be true. Does your research tell us whether there are certain conditions in which different perspectives and ideas can fruitfully coexist?
Let's see, if I have examples of conditions where, what did you say, where very different views can be fruitful?
Yes, so it says, yeah, whether there are certain conditions in which different perspectives and ideas can fruitfully coexist.
Well, if you actively in certain interdisciplinary constellations where if you have I've been involved in several of those in Sweden and abroad with scientists from a wide range of perspectives, often opposing perspectives. But if you have initially a meta discussion where you discuss the rules and the principles of the knowledge sharing and exchange, and the importance of respect of the other's views, you have actually been able to see that people after a while start to respect each other's views in a way that they can complement each other rather well. And in the field in political science, they talk about deliberative democracy, where several experiments of that kind have been done, actually, where the idea is that people should come from many different groups in order to be more fruitful and creative.
Okay, so I'll do one final question. I've got two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So would you suggest it is healthy for the group to encourage some to avoid knowledge resistance, even while encouraging the group identity? So thinking that often progress comes from eventual acceptance of challenging viewpoints.
Oh, sorry, I don't hear very well. Could you please take it again? Sorry.
Sorry, the question is, would you suggest it is healthy for the group to encourage some to avoid knowledge resistance, some members of the group, even while encouraging the group identity, thinking that often progress comes from eventual acceptance of challenging viewpoints?
If it actually can be productive to ignore. Let me think here. Sometimes it can be. Let's see if I answer your question, but there are certain benefits to deliberate ignorance in order to avoid, for instance, in order to avoid treating all knowledge claims as worthy of the same amount of attention. We often have the view that, okay, if you believe that climate change is taking place and another says no, it's not taking place, there is a erroneous view that we should weigh these equally, but instead we should probably sometimes sort out or remove those arguments that have no scientific or is not based or backed up with any real evidence. We should instead weigh different views within that each have quite a lot of evidence behind them. But this is very tricky to do, and to sort the valuable knowledge and and so on. And my main point in this book is that individuals can rarely do this alone, and it gets more and more complicated. I've already mentioned that we have our personal biases and that we cannot just think away knowledge resistance, but we also have that technology is becoming far more advanced, and you can have Trump say everything. You can technically fake what people are saying and doing in various ways. So we will have more and more organizations that help us, that intend to help us sort the valuable or valid knowledge claims from the unvalid ones. But again, that's a hugely political issue as well. I don't know if that was close to your question here, but it was a bit difficult hearing what you were saying.
Sorry, thanks, Mike. So the final question, I'll try not to say brief. So are there any solutions to improving why we ignore certain knowledge that is sort of long-term beneficial for us? So for an example of that is I recently read that the number of British 5-year-olds receiving both MMR jabs has fallen to 87%. And obviously you have climate change. So do we need more regulation of knowledge sharing organizations, or is it more self-awareness and the responsibility on individuals?
Yeah, the boring question is both, of course, but again, we cannot trust ourselves as individuals as doing this more. Of course, as individuals, in school we should all teach the kids to be critical and use several sources and so on. But it is far more difficult than that. So we need regulations or rules for how various news sources or social media spread their information or their claims. We need structures, rules, or at least procedures for knowledge sharing organizations to avoid false information. But we also need to create group structures, that we talked about that earlier, in academia and media and education, where people from various backgrounds are mixed, because we are all are very close to just confirming our own beliefs or the beliefs of our own group. And it's not just that's problematic and dangerous. It's also boring and hinders innovation to come about if we stick to our views so much. So but also we need a public service media with the ambition of reaching wide ranges of groups. You have actually seen in countries that have a more public service media that the knowledge resistance or fact resistance has been significantly lower than in countries that don't have that. And in my book I give several examples of how you can, in some this has to do with providing good facts and so on, but providing them in a social context that they really can be understood and appreciated by us as people. And it can also involve role models that help us recognize certain knowledge claims that we have avoided earlier and so on. So yes, a lot of structural efforts along with education for individuals.